Our first speaker, Marta Vera, is a native of El Paso, Texas. She was appointed Honorary Consul of Spain in El Paso for 20 counties in Texas on October 1st, 2015. She is an arbitrator and business owner at the Vera Group LLC. She has a BS and MS in cell biology and biochemistry from the University of Texas at El Paso, and a master's degree in international law, foreign policy, and foreign trade from the Instituto Superior de Derecho y Economía de Madrid, Spain. She also has completed the United Nations Unitary Executive Diploma in International Diplomatic Law and Honorary Consul. She is president of the World Affairs Council of El Paso and a board member of Heroes de Cabete based in Cartagena, Spain. She is a member of the American Society of International Lawyers and Transparency International, a global coalition to end corruption. She works to promote business, education, and the history of Spain in the New World with a special focus on the Camino de Tierra Adentro. She has made numerous presentations on this topic in Salamanca, Valencia, Toledo, Madrid, and Cartagena. This year, she will be speaking in the Castilla-Leon region. She is currently translating the 5th volume of the Mystical City of God on the life of Sor Maria de Jesus de Agreda, a Spanish nun who bilocated to the North American Southwest to evangelize the natives of Quevedo. Without further ado, Ms. Vera.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. I'm going to talk a little bit about the evangelization of all of New Spain, from Mexico on north. What was really important with the Juan de Oñate were that there were 9 Franciscan friars that came with him. And this is part of the work that I'm doing. So what do honorary consuls do, other than help people give passports and visas and study visas and help people move to Spain who want to move to Spain? We also work on promoting history and culture. And so one of the things that I've been working on since 2013, before I was appointed, is to help promote the culture from San Belisario on northward. So I work very closely with other groups in northern New Mexico to try to erase La Leyenda Negra, which is, all of the negative stuff that's been talked about with Spain did, but it's not true, and you need to go ahead and look at archives, read the archives, what happened. Okay. So we're talking about the evangelization, and this is in Spanish, so this is going to talk in Spanish. But this is El Paso, Texas, and so when the Juan de Oñate came here, there were already laws to protect the natives. It was very important since 1492, when Queen Isabella was queen. She made many, many, many laws. One of them, we're going to be talking about crypto-Judaic heritage, which many of us do have. And many of us don't know that we have it, but yes, we do have it. Because most of the people that came in 1492, she said, we want everybody to be Catholic. That's why she's called Queen Isabel la Católica. And if you didn't convert, you had to either move or die. So those were the options. So who were the people that came to settle the New World? The New World was settled by converted Jews. Because the people that were Jewish were the people that were the accountants, the doctors, the lawyers, everybody that needed to be able to create an economy, people that knew how to run a country. And so they were the ones that came here. Not what you think. There were no people that were coming here that were criminals or anything like that. They were all professionals and people that are going to create and establish a society. So, we have Leyes de la And the Indias were the Indies, because they thought this was going to be India. And it wasn't. So when they figured out that it wasn't, Queen Isabella signed everything that she had asked about in the laws. She abolished slavery. She allowed people to marry whoever they wanted to. She made the natives citizens of Spain, and so they were to be protected. They were to be paid like anybody that would work for a Spanish company. So in 1504, she had a decree, and she signed it on the 12th of October, which is El Día de la Hispanidad. And she signs it 3 days before she dies. And there she states that all the natives that want to be Spanish citizens and want to be protected by Spain are going to be citizens, and they will receive equal pay as any other Spaniard. And she wanted to prevent any kind of slavery. So she signs that in 1504. In 1512 to 1513, Leyes de los Burgos, and I hope that Mr. Quesada will be going with me to Spain, because that's one of the things that I'm going to be looking at, is the actual laws that were signed there. And we will be doing some studies according to trying to find the land grant that was given to Isleta del Sur Pueblo, and any other historical documents that actually talk about the Pueblo. So these were signed by Fernando, King Fernando. And who was King Fernando? He was married to who? Isabella. Yeah, so he was married to Isabella. And so he signs a decree that says that you will prevent any kind of abuse of the natives. In 1524, King Carlos V, or Charles V, signs another Council of the Indians and La Moneda de las Casas to defend any of the native, anything that they find over here. In 1542, he also signs the good treatment and preservation of all natives, Indians, and it also prevents slavery. So we've got, throughout the years, different laws that are being laid down. He also stated that the soldiers were not to be the first people to meet up with the Indians. It would be the Franciscans. So, or any of, and the Franciscans were the order that were selected to come and evangelize. So, that's really important to know. So as we stated earlier, 9 Franciscans come, and then they decide, the first ones that came decided to go back to Mexico because they were afraid. And then 9 more Franciscans come and join the expedition, and they actually catch up to them like really close to here. And so he arrives to the pueblos of New Mexico, and he talks to the pueblos that he finds. He has them sign an agreement that says, if you want to be a Spanish citizen, then we will protect you. And so those copies are in the archives, and we will be looking at those as well. So this happened in October of 1598. The 9 Franciscans that are here are all divided up into different regions, different pueblos, to catechize and do catechism for the natives and convert them or work on that. So we come to the Lady in Blue, and I've talked about the Lady in Blue before. I don't know if any of you have But she was born in 1602. In 1620, she becomes a nun at 18 years old. And she begins to levitate at that time. The priest asked her to stop her levitations because it's drawing a crowd, and it's not necessarily people that want to go to church. They're there to see her levitate. So she said, I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to stop this. And the priests say, well, you just have to pray for it to stop. So she prays for it to stop. And she's concerned about her father and her brothers, because when she went into becoming a novice, her mother converted their home, and the mother and the two sisters became nuns. The father and the two brothers became Franciscan monks. They gave their lives back to God and decided to separate and do God's work. So she is wanting to pray about her brothers and her father, and pray for their safety in wherever it is that they're going to be taken. So what happens? She begins to bilocate. And she says in her book that God took her in his hand, showed her that the earth was round, and brought her to a new land. And in that new land, God said, those are also my children, and I love them like I love you. And I want them to be in my family. So she says she doesn't know how. She doesn't know if an angel brought her or that hand of God brought her, but she would appear in the new world. And she would speak to the pueblos. She would speak to the natives that she found. She actually talked about different tribes, and she came here over 500 times. She met many, many natives. And so she talked about appearing in La Quivira. So who was here? Fray Alonso Benavides came with Don Juan de Oñate, and he was to take care of the mission. So she's sending the natives to be baptized at the mission in Albuquerque, as well as to other rivers where she knows that there's going to be a priest, so that those pueblos can get, or tribes, can get baptized. So, Fray Benavides asked the natives, who is this person who is telling you to come here? Because they were carrying crosses. They would carry a cross so that the priest would know that they came in peace. And they said, there's a lady in blue who comes to visit us, and she speaks to us in our native language, and we understand her. And she asked us to come and get baptized. So Fray Benavides goes to Spain to ask Rey Felipe IV if he knows who this lady is, because the natives talk about her. There is a letter at the Vatican, who I will explain a little bit later about that, where he has written about it. This is a painting that is at her convent that someone painted of her apparitions in the New World. Okay, so we said she appeared more than 500 times. A lady in blue comes to visit them. They go to the mission in San Agustin, and she also says that she appears in La Quivira. Many people believe that La Quivira was La Gran Quivira that's in New Mexico. But I don't think so, because she appeared in places farther away. The Hopi say that they've seen her in what is now Arizona, So this quivira is actually what I believe is La Quivira de Coronado. It's wherever Coronado is. Because we know she bilocated to New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, and I believe she went to Oklahoma and Kansas. But, I'm trying to find those native tribes as well. And it's going to be very difficult because they were moved, and many of them were killed in the 1800s. So, after 1821, so more like 1860s. Okay, so she is bilocating. She has people go. In 1613, San Agustin Mission was built, and this is where Fray Benavides was. Fray Benavides makes his way to Spain, talks to the king and said, do you know this lady? Do you know who the lady in blue could be? And he says, no, I don't, but we'll try to find her. So they actually find her in 1631. So Maria says that she appeared to the kingdom of Yumanas, with a Y, not a J. Yumanas. And she also appeared to Chillescas, Chambusos, or Chambufos, Fidas, and Piros. She mentions these. Do we have any Piros here? So the Isleta Pueblo was actually one of the pueblos that she visited. But were they living where they're living now? I don't know that. And that's something that I need our Isleta del Pueblo to help me with. Because apparently they were living somewhere outside of that area. So she says she's coming from the Orient and she's moving west. And she ends up in the kingdoms of Quivira and Yumanas. Okay, so she decides that she's going to stop by locating herself and asks that to stop because she's starting to get a little bit of notoriety, especially when the king and Fray Benavides visit her. So King Felipe starts to ask her questions about his country. Spain is actually falling. There are many wars that they're having, especially with England. And, the money is becoming scarce. And so Maria tells him, do not raise taxes because the people can barely live. So don't do that. You're going to have to look to God. And you're going to have to change your life. Somebody wants to kill you, and this is the guy that you've had running the country. And so he does a little test, and sure enough, they try to kill him. And so he asks her to be his spiritual guide, which she does become. And during this time, she writes The Mystical City of God, which is a 4-volume book. I'm translating the 5th volume, which will be available probably by September. And it'll be in English so that you can read it. It is really amazing, and it will take you back to be more faithful. And I think that we need that in our world right now. So, the importance of the Camino Real. We have oral histories of the Pueblo. The first mission in New Mexico is Isleta. Is in Isleta, San Agustin. In the Cochiti also have told me that there are petroglyphs of the Lady in Blue. So this has been part of my study. And we know that in San Angelo there is a huge rock called Paint Rock that you can visit. And there is a not a petroglyph, there is a pictograph of Sor Maria with the cross. And so people were talking about her. People are still talking about her. In fact, the Hopi talk about not wanting to convert and trying to kill her. And they would shoot her with arrows or or throw rocks at her. She would fall down, but then get back up again and go to the heavens. So that is still one of their legends. So that was shared to me by our cacique. Okay, so she wrote 600 letters to the king. He would write on one side and she would answer him on the other. They are all still at the convent. And those are in archives, and so you can tell a little bit about what was happening in his life as well as in the country. Okay. So we already talked about that. Okay, so what did, this is our view of El Paso. This is the original mystical city of God that was printed in 1680. And then I like kind of showing the very first missions and when they were born. Iglesia de San Juan de los Caballeros was rebuilt, and this is what it looked like originally. This is the one at Ackerman.
Is that San Juan de los Caballeros? Was that up in...
San Juan de los Caballeros, which is now Okeyobenke.
Okeyobenke.
Yes. And this one is the Ackerman Pueblo. It was built in 1623. But one of the things that the investigation that I'm doing now, a year ago, I was called by a nurse who calls me and says, "Are you Martha Vet? Are you the person that studies Maria de Jesus de Ávila?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "I need to talk to you, and you need to talk to Dr. What's his name? Roland, and he is in Clovis." So I call him, and he says, "You need to call Monsignor Nealand in Lubbock, Texas." And so I called him, and he said, "Well, don't call me Monsignor anymore. I'm a retired priest. So my name is Malcolm." So I called Malcolm. You know, I was talking to Malcolm, and this was a year ago. He says, "You have to come because I have found petroglyphs of who I believe is Sor Maria de Jesus de Ágreda." Last week, I had the opportunity of going to see these petroglyphs. And it is Sor Maria de Jesus de Ágreda. Not from the pictures that he sent me, but from one very important pictograph that I saw that reminded me of the pictograph in San Angelo. So this is a petroglyph of a pictograph in San Angelo. It's the very same thing. And so, you know, these petroglyphs had a woman talking to some natives. They also had some marks, and they think that all of this was engraved on the rock in about between 1624 and 1628, because there was a supernova that you could see in the sky, and it was very bright. And so they had made the mark of that star. And so Malcolm had gone with an archaeologist from Texas Tech to go review these in 1988. And here we are, 2023, and that was the next time that he goes out there to see these petroglyphs with me. And so in September, I am going to present a talk on that particular pictograph and the pictographs that we found, petroglyphs that we found there. In Rome, because there is a conference on Sor Maria de Jesus de Ágreda. The Vatican is looking at our mission trail. It's looking at the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro to make it a Via Santa because that is where evangelization comes in here. So this is very, very interesting, and it's very important to our area, to our region, to our pueblos, that we are being recognized. And so, yes, I'm just very excited about that, and I want to thank you all for inviting me to speak about this. I hope you learned something from this. Do you have any questions?
But Mr. Rick Quesada is a tribal member of Isleta del Sur Pueblo. He was born in El Paso, Texas. His career goal is to become a professional historian, and his research interests are Spanish colonial archival records about the New Mexico Pueblo Indians, mainly Isleta del Sur Pueblo. He is currently the Director of Cultural Preservation, where he works to preserve the culture, history, and language of the Isleta del Sur Pueblo. As a director, he works on government-to-government consultation for the National Historic Preservation Act's projects, language preservation programs, and fostering traditional skills within the Pueblo. As a Tico language speaker, he also teaches the Tico language to tribal members. Quesada holds a BA in anthropology and a minor in linguistics from the University of Texas at El Paso. He also holds an MA in history from the University of Texas at El Paso. One of his many skills includes traditional drum making. Mr. Quesada.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of our people. So my people, we originally are not from the El Paso area. We are from the Pueblo of Isleta, New Mexico. The mother Pueblo, which in our language we call it Tututui, which basically translates to the big sister village. That's basically what it means. We were forced by the Spanish in 1680 to come down here. We didn't voluntarily come as popular belief. All right, there is a book up there. It's called The Revolt, the 1680 Pueblo Revolt of the New Mexico Pueblos. And it is an original translation of Antonio, the original military transcript of Antonio de Otermin. It was translated by a guy by the name of Charles Wilson Hackett. Hackett is almost all historians that ever write about the Pueblo Revolt, that is like the Bible. Okay? So what happened was that Charles Wilson Hackett was a professor at UT Austin in the early 20th century, 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, maybe all the way to the 1950s. And on a whim, he was given the permission to visit El Archivo Nacional in Mexico City. As he goes in there, to his surprise, he finds Antonio de Otermin's original military manuscript during the 1680 Pueblo Revolt. And what he does is he translates it from Spanish to English. If you guys want to search it, it's in 2 volumes. Volume 1, Volume 2. Charles Wilson Hackett. The 1680 Pueblo Revolt of the New Mexico Indians. Volume 1, Volume 2. They were during the Pueblo Revolt when the Indians were revolting against the Spanish were trying to find out who was in charge of the revolt, how it had been planned, and how it had been executed. So they have a lot of, what do you call those? In Spanish, they're known as, I'm going to say it in English, kind of like testimonials. the Spanish were torturing a lot of the Indians to extract the information, to see who had planned the revolt during the 1680 Pueblo Revolt. They found out that Pope was in charge of the Pueblo Revolt. Are you guys familiar with Pope?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm going to elaborate a little bit because it really ties into the history of my people here. Pope was a Tewa Indian. All right. He was a Pueblo Indian from the Pueblo of San Juan. All right. I'm going to go a little bit further into our language. All right. And I'm going to compare it to Spanish. All right. Because it kind of lends itself to Spanish, right? So we all know that the mother tongue of Spanish is Latin, right? And out of Latin comes Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian, right? So us as Spanish speakers, right? Anytime we hear someone talking in either Portuguese or we hear someone talking in Italian, we can kind of make it out, right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, the mother tongue of Tiwa is Kiowa-Tanoan. All right? Out of Kiowa-Tanoan, that's the mother tongue. Out of Kiowa-Tanoan, you got Tiwa, you got Tewa, you got Towa. And the previous speaker that was talking before me, he mentioned the Beatles. Beetle was also like Kiowa-Tanoan. We kind of understood each other. The closest one to Tiwa is Beetle. It's the closest one. But Tiwa branches off into two. You got the northern Tiwa speakers, which are the Pueblo Picolis and the Pueblo Taos. And then you got the southern Tiwa speakers, which is my people, the Pueblo Bisleta and the Pueblo Sandia. I hear the Sandia speak, I understand everything they're saying. And of course the Isletas, because that's the mother Pueblo, right? But in preparing for the Pueblo Revolt, guess what the Indians did? All of them learned Spanish, a common language that they all could communicate. They could communicate, and then they would go to their respective pueblos, and they would speak their own language. The Spanish can understand them. So language was very, very crucial in planning the revolt. So in 1675, the Spanish, in their efforts to stamp out native religion, they captured all of the New Mexico pueblos' medicine men. And one of the medicine men happened to be Pope. Pope is tortured. Most of his contemporaries are hung, and most of them are in prison. Pope, being from the Pueblo of San Juan, which was one of the strongest Tewa pueblos, they managed to assemble around 75 to about 80 warriors, and they go and they pressure the Spanish governor to release Pope. And to their amazement, they release him. Upon his release, he starts planning the revolt. It takes him 5 years, from 1675 to 1680. The revolt, by all accounts, is fairly simple. But what was real crucial was its secrecy. It had to be secret. Only the top level elite leaders knew of the plan. So what Pope did is he had a couple of cords. And he drew, I think he made 4, some people say 5, some people say 6 knots in each of the cords. And he made a little over 20. Each cord represented a pueblo. Okay? So, Pope makes all these cords, and he has a couple of runners. All right? Back in the day, it was outlawed, or the Spanish had outlawed, for Indians could not own horses, much less use them. All right? It was an outlaw. But what the Indians had, or the Pueblo had, was they had runners. They had young kids that were 15, 16 years of age. These guys were like physically fit kids, man. They could run what today we consider a marathon, 25 to 30 miles a day. Each pueblo had runners, and they could really listen to the day. All the pueblos are quick, right? So he has all these cords, and he tells the runners to give them to the Huitlahuedes. The Huitlahuedes are the war chiefs. En español es los capitanes de guerra de los pueblos. Huitlahuedes is how we say war capital in Antigua. It's said differently in Toba, it's said differently in Antigua, or in Cary. That's our word, Huitlahuedes. He's a war captain. So he has them do all that. The message was simple. For every day that passed, they would undo a knot. All the pueblos get the cord at the same time. And then once the cord had no knot, then they were to kill the first Spanish in each of the pueblos, which were usually the priests. And once they had done that, then they were going to head over to Santa Fe and kill the governor. All right? Now, please bear in mind that the Indians had suffered 82 years under two systems, the encomienda system and the repartimiento. The encomienda system was a way for Spanish soldiers to extract tribute from the Indians in the force of labor and food. The repartimiento system was a way for the Catholic priests to extract labor to build the beautiful churches that we see today from the Indians. Above that, they were taking advantage of the girls. That's what they were targeting. They do that, and the battle for Santa Fe, the Battle of Santa Fe starts on August 10, 1680. It takes them about 9 days to get Otermin out of Santa Fe. Finally, he retreats to our mother pueblo, the Pueblo of Isleta, 1680. Mid-August 1680. The Pueblo of Isleta was not informed of the revolt because we were way south. So they caught us. That's where he started to regroup. He wanted to come back and reconquer. The Indians were just too tough. They were too tough. They had been preparing many, many years for this revolt. So finally, what he decides to do is most of our brothers up north, they started escaping to the hills. Some of our people were captured, brought down as slaves, burden bearers, and hostages to what today is Juarez, right? Because Juarez was the original Paso del Norte. A year later, he wants to reconquer New Mexico. So he goes back. He is defeated again at the Battle of Cochiti. He stops one more time at the Pueblo of Isleta, and he captures another 385 kilos and brings them down to the El Paso area. My people were the descendants of those two groups of people that were forcefully brought here in 1680 and 1681. And the packet book details it. So we get here, 1680. Finally, the Pueblo of Isleta del Sur is established. 2 years later, 1682. Along with Isleta del Sur being established, the Pueblo of Senecu, Piros, in what is today Ciudad Juarez, is also established, and finally Socorro del Sur, just down the road for Piros, and I think the Socorros had majority Piros, but some of them were Haynes, I believe, some of them were Santo Domingos, and things of that nature. So we get established here. We do not return to the mother Pueblo. We during the revolt, we brought some very, very interesting and religious artifacts to the El Paso area. One of them being a drum. The other set being a set of canes of office that were issued by the Spanish. And the third thing are cochino masks for ceremonial purposes. In 1751, as Martha was saying, we get a land grant issued by a guy by the name of Tomás Vélez de Gachutu. He was a Spanish governor at the time, and what they would do is they would issue land grants to the pueblos using the Spanish league as the standard measurement. And the Spanish league, o en español, una legua, is 2.5 miles. Okay? So there were many center points for measuring the Spanish league. Most of the New Mexico public, the center of their Spanish league was measured at the main crucifix at the center of the cemetery. In our case, it was at the front door of the Isla Mission, 2.5 miles in each direction. Today, the Spanish land grant for Isleta del Sur Pueblo, in today's terms, I would put the northwest corner, northwest corner, at the corner of I-10 and Litrevino. The northeast corner would be the corner of I-10 and Horizon Boulevard. The southwest corner would be near around the Juarez International Airport. And then finally, the southeast corner would be across the Isleta International Bridge in Mexico. When the Spanish land grant was given to our people, the river, the Rio Grande, was actually on the northern side. So we were on the southern side. But in 1848, two things happened. Right? Texas becomes part of the United States, as well as New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona, and California. But also the river moves, it shifts to its present location. So what that happened is it cut our original Spanish grant in half. The majority of it being on the American side, half of it, like about a third of it being on the Mexican side. So we have tribal members actually in the Juarez. And they are tribally enrolled members of our club. We are not unique in that area. The Kickapoo, most of their people live in Mexico, but they're fairly recognized, as well as the Yaquis, as well as Apache groups. We're not unique in that area. And then finally, we get here, we get Christianized, and we accept Saint Anthony, San Antonio. So we consider ourselves Mission Catholic Indians. We're not unique, right? Most of the pueblos in New Mexico, all the pueblos in New Mexico are Mission Indian. In fact, some of the pueblos in New Mexico are named after Catholic saints. El pueblo de San Juan, el pueblo de San Ildefonso, el pueblo de Santa Clara, to name a few. Right? So we've been celebrating the Feast of St. Anthony here in the El Paso area for a little over 340 years. But St. Anthony was also the patron saint of when we lived in Isleta, New Mexico. So, a little history trivia. Do any of you guys know when the Isleta mission burned down?
1918.
Close. 1908. The church burned in 1908. When we were coming down from the revolt, my people brought a statue of St. Anthony. They brought him with them along with the other religious things. It was carved. It was carved out of wood. And guess what happened? The 1908 fire burned with it.
As a Mexican American with a broad DNA ethnic spectrum, she also appreciates the culture and history of her ancestors and those of our vast border area. These are the values that permeate her teaching. Ms. Gonzalez lives with her son and his cat in her childhood home. What's the cat's name?
At a Hanukkah celebration in 2018, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the popular Puerto Rican congresswoman from New York, surprised a small crowd by announcing that she has Jewish ancestry.
My family consisted of Sephardic Jews.
Later that same week, a groundbreaking study came out of Latin America. After testing DNA samples from 6,000 randomly selected people across the region, researchers found that 23% of them had at least 5% of their DNA from Spanish Jewish heritage. Back in 2015, the Spanish government announced that they grant citizenship to any non-Spaniards who could prove that they are descendants of Jews who were expelled from the country in the 15th century. By late 2019, Spain revealed that they received 127,000 applications. The most popular countries: Mexico, Venezuela, and Colombia. All this points to one big question: why do so many Latin Americans have Jewish heritage? To understand the answer, we've got to go back to the year 1492. Two huge historical events took place that year, and both had serious lasting consequences. First, Spain started to colonize the Americas. And second, back on their side of the Atlantic, the Spanish government enacted the Alhambra Decree, which forced Jews to either convert to Catholicism or leave the country for good. Spain had already been murdering or forcibly converting Jews for over a century. That was part of the Spanish Inquisition. But this was the final nail in the coffin. Now, Jews had only two options: get baptized or get out. Nobody knows exactly how many Jews chose the second option and fled. Keeping a census of Jewish citizens wasn't exactly a priority for medieval Spain. On the low end, some historians think it was tens of thousands, though others think it could have been as many as 1 million. Regardless, it seems that most of Spain's Jews decided to stick around and agreed to become Catholics. But not all Jews handled the transition the same way. Some weren't very religious to start with, so changing creeds wasn't such a hard choice given the alternative. These types of converts became known as New Catholics. Others were determined to practice their Judaism in secret. They were called Marranos, but today that's generally considered a derogatory term, and the phrase crypto-Jews has become more popular. In Hebrew, both groups are called Anusim, which means people who are forced to abandon their Judaism. And in English, they are known as conversos, literally people who converted. Regardless of the name, back in the 1400s, the Spanish Inquisition and later Spanish policies had one goal when it came to Judaism: eliminate it. At the same time, Spain ramped up its colonization of the Americas. Over the next 4 centuries, millions of Spaniards arrived on the shores of the New World. Even though the government tried to restrict the movement of conversos, it was really difficult to keep track of them, since they were, after all, Catholics now. Many conversos wound up escaping to the Americas, hoping to start a new life. But the Spanish government caught on and sent agents of the Inquisition to the American colonies to locate undercover Jews. When they found them, they burned them at the stake. Despite the dangers, lots of conversos held on to Jewish traditions in private. Some lit candles on Friday nights, others refused to eat leavened bread around Easter, which always falls within a few days of Passover. As generations passed, the descendants of those original conversos began noticing curious things about their families. Like, why do we place stones on our family's graves? How come mom never cooks pork like everyone else? And why does grandma refuse to travel on Saturdays? Today, with DNA tests that are popular and affordable, more and more Latin Americans, from the southern tip of Chile to the deserts of New Mexico, are discovering that they have Jewish ancestry. Their reactions are diverse. Some are happy with the Catholic faith and the culture they were brought up in. Others blend their Judaism with Christianity. For example, the Adventist Church, which has many Latin American members, combines elements of Judaism into Christianity, such as observing the Sabbath on Saturday. But others choose to embrace their heritage. Some even convert. For those who do, their genealogy can be a ticket to a new life. On top of Spain's repatriation plans, Israel has its own law which offers citizenship to Jews around the world. The country's Ministry of the Diaspora is exploring ways to make it easier for conversos to make Aliyah. What began as a tragedy in the 15th century could today become a multicultural boon for the Jewish homeland. It's also a testament to the strength of the Jewish identity after hundreds of years of persecution. Even though conversos haven't had it easy, their story is a fascinating and important one. With the rise of simple DNA tests and a growing interest in heritage and identity, more Latin Americans and people around the world are learning just how complex their identity and heritage really are. Discovering our shared ancestry can help us better understand history, both on a personal and global scale. And hopefully, with that knowledge, we can overcome the intolerance and prejudice that have divided religions and cultures for thousands of years. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, consider subscribing. And if at a Hanukkah celebration in 2018,
So we have included a couple of facts. As you saw on the video, there's a grand exodus from Europe, Spain and Portugal, and also from the Middle Eastern countries. A migration had already begun prior to this. And also there's many Jewish bloodlines and ancestry in North Africa as well. And this would be the region where a lot of the migration is going to come from on different Jewish bloodlines. There's in this map here, they're going to be showing you how the Christians and Islamic people and the periods of time that were the conquistadors, reconquest of the Christians in 1250, the area reconquered by the Christians again in 1500, after the Islamic people were in the region for hundreds of years as well. And here we have the Ashkenazi Hebrew Bible is one of the descendants of Noah's. Ashkenaz is the first son of Gomer and Japhetic patriarch. So on here we have the Western world beginning the 10th century, Muslim world from the 9th to 11th centuries, the Byzantine Empire in the 11th century, Christianized Roman Empire in yellow, and then areas of substantial Jewish population. And then in the Muslim world is the green, and then the Byzantine world would be the bright orange, which would be like there in the Byzantine Empire and near Italy as well. Next slide.
Sfax, that's the Hebrew name for Spain. Jews lived and often thrived in this land for centuries, until just over 500 years ago, religious intolerance forced them to flee. Yet even as they left behind their homes to seek a future elsewhere, the Jews also left behind an enduring cultural and spiritual legacy, one that continues to resonate throughout Spain more than half a millennium later.
What I write here is a student of architecture from Paris, where I was studying, and the student this place is linked to many other parts of my life, my culture. After many years of being in a yeshiva in a Talmudic school in Israel, I discovered that what I learned about was in the reality of the city, in the world, that are under the earth, that are everywhere in this space. This neighborhood has marked me very strongly. This was the Jewish neighborhood. All these buildings, like 6 or 7 streets, forming like a square, is the remains of the old Jewish neighborhood. It was such an important city for Judaism, for the creation of the Jewish culture during centuries. And now when you walk around, you discover many very teeny remains. There's almost nothing physical that you can see above the ground.
You mean that other people that walk through here and not feel any difference?
Exactly. For me, to live in this country that is so full of Jewish meanings, of Jewish experience, is incredible. And to be able to rediscover it. Hasta luego. Shana Tova. Dale Shana Tova a toda la familia. Chao.
Es la vida sentir sol, una blanca y otra rosa, donde me disco me da preciso del amor, amar mi luz, Cuando yo tenía 20 años no conocía lo que era el pueblo sefardí. Empecé a querer conocer más sobre esta cultura y poco a poco tuve la suerte de conocer a sefarditas directamente y mi amor por la música fue cada vez mayor y sobre todo mi amor por la cultura sefardí que considero la cultura propia, la cultura ibérica.
When the Jews left Spain, they left behind a part of what they were. Their culture, their stories, and their songs. The sounds of their Spanish Jewish language, Ladino. It struck a chord with Paco Diaz.
Cuando escucho ladino, tengo la impresión de haber vivido esa vida. Para mí es dulce, dulce lengua sefardí. Para mí es, cuando escucho hablar ladino, me siento muy bien. I feel good. Una tarde de verano, así por la morería y enamorado al fin de una fuente fría. Io la dice una bella, io la dice una linda, dejaré de mis caballos, esas aguas cristalinas.
The Moors were Muslims. When they invaded the Iberian Peninsula back in the 7th century and replaced its Christian rulers, they brought in ancient wisdom and new ideas. Looking at the Alhambra reminded me of their genius and of their attitude towards the Jews who had lived here since Roman times. It wasn't always perfect. There were plenty of ups and downs, but for the better part of 400 years under Muslim rule, Jews were allowed to develop and prosper. They enjoyed times so good that we remember them today as our golden age in Spain.
Y los judíos colaboraron con los musulmanes para asentar y estabilizar el dominio musulmán en Al-Ándalus. Un judío granadino, Moshe Ben Ezra, decía que gracias al árabe descubrieron los secretos de la lengua hebrea. Dice, el árabe nos abrió los ojos. La historia judía está plagada de personalidades extraordinarias y una de estas personalidades fue Shmuel Ben Agrer, porque sabías que tenía una caligrafía árabe extraordinaria. Entonces, al conocer bien la lengua y la caligrafía árabe, pues logró ascender hasta el mayor puesto de la administración, que es el del Sir del rey de Granada. Ayudaba a comunidades judías y también pues compraba libros que traía al Oriente. De manera se creó aquí en Granada un foco de cultura judía, una corte del que pues se vieron beneficiados muchos otros.
Southern Spain, I tried to imagine what the Jews who lived here back then might have seen. It wasn't hard because a lot of what the Moors built really stood the test of time, like this magnificent mosque, even if it later became a cathedral. The houses of the old Jewish order don't exist anymore. But I can see that Córdoba still remembers that we were here. The Moors turned Córdoba into a center of art, architecture, poetry, and philosophy. And under the Moors, Córdoba became one of the world's most important centers of Jewish learning and scholarship. Among those responsible for that, two stand out above all the rest: Seghs ibn Shaprut and this man, Moses Maimonides.
יש שני שטחים של מחשבה יהודית. יש השטח היהודי הרציונלי ויש השטח המיסטי של הקבלה. בשני התחומים היהודים הספרדים של אז הצליחו. כדוגמה הרמב"ם, רבי משה בן רבי מובהק, שחי בכל העולם. והוא לא רק היה איש ההלכה, וכתב את משנה תורה, שהוא ענקי לעולם ההלכה. אדם היה פילוסוף, מעמיק מאוד. כל התרבות היוונית והמוסלמית בספרו, מורה נבוכים, מופיע לא רק את הקומה הגדולה שלו כיהודי, כאיש שמבין את תוכן תוכנו של המורשת היהודית, וגם יודע ליצור קשר בין הדברים החיוביים שיש בתרבות אחרים ובין הדברים הבסיסיים של עם ישראל.
There were times when Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived together in this town, when three cultures mixed. That's food for thought, and it's a point of pride for people here. I even found signs of it at my hotel.
Estamos en una casa en la cual han vivido diferentes culturas y nada más entrar por la puerta puedes ver los cuatro símbolos donde se ve la A de Abraham como el origen de todas las religiones. Luego tenemos la estrella de David, la cruz de Jerusalén y la media luna. Entonces, un poco es como lo que somos, es una casa abierta al mundo y todo el mundo es bienvenido.
When Francisco invited me down to the basement, I had no idea what he had in mind.
Pues vamos a enseñarte lo que es la joya de la casa, son también los retratos árabes y que tenemos aquí judíos y romanos que han aparecido durante la rehabilitación del hotel. Esto todo estaba bajo tierra y aquí encontramos pues restos de Roma. Esto es romano.
This is from Rome.
Tenemos aquí restos de columnas que aparecieron en la rehabilitación de la casa y entonces pues estamos todavía poniendo en funcionamiento todo este tipo de cosas. Tenemos el origen de las murallas de la ciudad. Todo esto pues va desde los romanos, mudéjar, musulmán, cristianos, restos de un pozo y luego continuamos por aquí a lo que es la parte más importante de todo lo que está descubierto.
Wow.
Aquí es donde más se está trabajando en esta zona y tenemos aquí restos de un aljibe, tenemos aquí restos de los antiguos conductos de agua para los jardines.
Museum, and Dr. Roger Martinez-Davila, your professor at the University of Colorado, and Sonia Loya, your artisan and educator. I wanted to thank you all for joining us to talk about this segment about the Jewish experience in New Mexico, especially crypto-Jews. Roger, I want to start with you. We just saw this piece about Isabel Sandoval, a poet and her search for her identity as a converso or a crypto-Jew. Who were the conversos? Why did they come to New Mexico?
Sure, it's a great question. So conversos essentially are Jewish converts to Christianity. and they begin converting to Christianity in the late 1300s in Spain. It accelerates in the 1400s.
That they converted by force.
Well, and this is the really challenging piece. We know that some Jews are converting by force because of extreme violence against them by Christian populations. Some are choosing to convert, they're adopting Catholicism at that time period, and others are just, they're trying to find a middle way. They're not sure what's going to really happen. We know it really accelerates in 1492 when the Jews were expelled from Spain, and finally when we get to the Americas in the 1500s, some Jewish converts to Christianity, these conversos who are traveling with the conquistadores, with the colonists that are coming into Mexico and New Mexico in the 1500s, secretly as crypto-Jews, kind of still practicing some religious beliefs that are Jewish, and others are kind of full-blown Catholics that are of a Jewish ancestry, but they've moved on. So it's a really complicated population.
So some of them were outwardly practicing Catholicism, maybe secretly holding on to traditions. Some are sort of nominally practicing Christianity to fit in.
Well, and this is really, I think, reflective of what's happening in Spain. So if we want to contextualize that way, from 711 to 1492 in Spain, we had 800 years of Jews, Christians, and Muslims living alongside each other. The communities are very distinct, but over 800 years of living together, you start blending some practices. You start to influence each other. And what's interesting in the Americas is that, well, that's all over. By the time we hit 1492, when the Americas are discovered or encountered, as well as the expulsion of the Jews, that time period is over, and now all of a sudden people are really kind of hybridized individuals. There are all kinds of pieces inside of them, maybe distinctly Catholic, maybe distinctly Jewish.
And they're Catholic.
Well, if you look, Bishop's Manifest, you're not going to find anybody after 1492 who says, I am a Jew. And everyone who comes to the New World must be Christian. Everyone who's in a Spanish possession must express that Christian identity. So that's the point at which the Christian identity begins to overlay and become dominant over how you live outwardly in the world.
We should say that Spain was ruled by the Moors for hundreds of years.
Absolutely.
And that's one aspect, and then it's what we're talking about is a period when the Christians then drive the Moors out, take control, becomes this more predominant identity or.
Sure, and then in 1492, when the Jews are driven out, those who stay are outwardly Christian, but maybe practicing Judaism at home, and others may be so thoroughly Christianized that they're not practicing Judaism. So what comes to the New World with the conquistadors, with the explorers, are people of, I would say, already hybridized identities.
And some of them are coming to maybe get away from central authority that's scrutinizing, well, are you really a convert?
Well, I think that's always the case, and I think so few people realize that the Inquisition was here in New Mexico. And that Inquisition officers were part of examining people's claims. And it was also a political tool. The Inquisition is very much a political tool here in New Mexico. And we have one particular governor and his wife in the 1660s who were accused of being Jewish. And then when you review the trial record, the behaviors, people are desperate to try to define why these people are so different. But the behaviors they describe are not anything that you would think of as Jewish practice. Doña Teresa Aguilera Roche, the governor's wife, is accused of reading books in a foreign language and laughing. She was raised in Italy. She was raised in Cartagena. She is a woman of the world. Her mother was Irish. So yes, she's reading in other languages. Here in New Mexico, people probably didn't read in Italian and English.
So it became a way to, like the Salem witch trials a little bit, to name your enemies and persecute them if you could accuse them of being Jews.
And we should put in this broader kind of framework too, which is what was the Inquisition about? So it's a Catholic institution founded in 1478 in Spain. In 1480 it goes into implementation and will exist all the way to the early 1800s. So as we know, Spain is its own kind of proper entity. Well, all of its dependencies, all the way to the Philippines, to Mexico, and South America.
To India.
Yeah, that's right.
To Goa.
To Goa and the Portuguese. They're actively pursuing cases of heresy. So these are specifically Catholics that can be investigated. So if you're Jewish, openly Jewish, there's no jurisdiction over you by the Catholic Church because you're not a member of the faith. So this is important. Now, if
But you can't live openly.
Right.
That's
You
right.
can't live openly because legally you don't exist.
I want to bring in Sonia because you have said in interviews that you always felt growing up in New Mexico, you never really felt at home in your Christian faith. You felt called by Judaism. Eventually you learned your family had hidden Jewish roots. They were conversos. Why was it hidden? Did they tell you? For so long?
No, it's a secret. Actually, I've been practicing Judaism on my own just because I was drawn to it and I left the church when I was 18. And I started practicing when I was about 36 on my own. And just trying to find, Jewish references, etc. Started doing my own genealogy. And
you just felt drawn to it? You didn't know for sure if you had this history?
No. I started in 1996 on my journey of, exploring, trying to discover, trying to find my own personal truth. And in 2004, I went to my parents to ask for a blessing to open up Batzian Hebrew Learning Center in Ruidoso, which I grew up Catholic there, and I didn't want to cause conflict for my family and myself. So I asked for my parents' blessings to do this center. And my dad that night not only gave me a blessing, but revealed to me the family secret that he had known he was Jewish since I was 6. So here, all this time I've been telling them as I discovered more and more through my own, family genealogy, trying to research that I thought we were Jews. All of our names were the Inquisition records. And he finally is telling me in 2004.
Why? But you're going through the 70s, 80s, 90s. What were they still afraid of?
My father was 6 years old when he was forced to keep the family secret. He was born in 1938. His uncles, my great uncles, had been liberated in camps in World War II. And one of my uncles came home and told my great-grandmother it was still not safe to be a Jew. And he told her the atrocities he had seen in World War II, liberated the camps, and the family names he had seen in the camps. And my father heard all this, and they swore him to family secrecy.
Roger, you know where her family came from in Spain.
Yeah, and this was just really exciting because I think for a lot of folks, they come to the Christian jurisdiction with a bit of skepticism. And I think that's important because, one, we do want to accept who they are. In the same sense, as an historian, I'm interested in the background. So in the case of Sonia Deloya's family, I study Jewish and Catholic families that immigrate from Spain into the Americas, largely from the Extremadura, which is where a lot of the pieces of our families came from. They came from places like Albuquerque. So it's really interesting in that sense. So the Deloyas, I know from Plasencia in the 1400s, there's a Rabbi, Abraham Deloya from Plasencia, who is openly leading that community. And what's really interesting is that I can see part of the reasons why they're hiding. Well, in the 1430s, there was this horrible conflict between Jewish and Catholic families, specifically Catholic families battling each other over control over the city. And who got caught in the middle? It was the Jewish population. And Rabbi...
Or convenient scapegoats.
Well, Rabbi Deloya was actually carried off in shackles and taken up into a mountain hideaway and didn't know what was going to happen to him. This is in the 1430s when he could still practice as a Jew. And later on, this problem is resolved where the Catholics finally can resolve that they will work with each other. But the end result is that the rabbi was carried off in shackles and is liberated. But there are 2 other Jewish individuals who were found drowned in a river.
Dr. Francis will be...
So there are different types of Jews. The Ashkenazi are in the blue. They are Germanic. They are a Germanic people, and they are further up north and in southwest regions of Southwest Asia. And then you have the Sephardic, which are from Spain and Iberian Peninsula and Portugal region. And then you'll see that the Sephardic, as they are migrating, they're in northern Africa and Egypt and Libya and other countries there in northern Africa. Then you have the Mizrahi, which are Eastern Jews, which would go into the Mediterranean region, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, and other regions. And then the independent groupings, which are other Jews, the Beta, the Kaifeng Jews. And so the Ashkenazi Jews are of Central Eastern European descent, traditionally speaking Yiddish. About 80% of the Jewish people today are Ashkenazi compared to the Sephardi. Also, there's a language called Ladino. I think you heard it in one of the first videos that you saw. What's interesting is that my neighbor, who's married, Venice, the author of this presentation, she's working on genealogy. She took it up as a hobby, and now she has a little business that she does research and family trees for people in genealogy. And this is my sister, my older sister, my younger brother, and my mother. And even though you may think that you're only 2% Jewish, it really, the likelihood that your ancestry is much larger if you look at the regions that you come from. For example, on my brother's side, he's 34% Spanish. My mother is 35% Spanish, and then my older sister was 34. My younger brother is only 20%. And then you add in the region, also Iberian Peninsula, Portuguese, 5% for my older sister, 7% for my mother, and 12% for my younger brother. So what is the difference between my older sister and my younger brother? That would mean that my brother, obviously my father, has a higher percentage from the region of Portugal. And then you look at the Basque region, they're my mother and my sister are pretty much at point at 9%, and then my brother is 12%, and then French as well. So if you look at the numbers across the board, my brother has a 50% probability of inheriting Sephardic Jew DNA, and then my mother would have been 58%, and then 52% my older sister. Maybe about 15, 20 years ago, one of my aunts, my mother's sister, doctoral thesis on the Jewish bloodline in this region. And she was looking at my aunt, she was living with my aunt, and my aunt is short and fair-complected and fair-haired, and she looked at her and she says, "Are you sure that you're not Jewish?" And funny story is that when I would look at my mother's those sepia tone pictures, instead of black and white, the ones that look kind of like a beige antique look to them. Before the eldest son, my mother's eldest brother, went off to World War II, the family decided to do a photograph. And so it's 10 children, and my grandmother and grandfather. And I used to look at that picture and I used to tell my mother, "Are you sure you're not Jewish?" And she'd tell me, "Oh, don't be ridiculous. How am I going to be Jewish? We're Catholics." And I told her at that time, with what little knowledge I had at that time, at about 19 or 20, I said, well, the Jews migrated from Europe into this region and into Spain. The Spanish Jews came into Mexico. So yes, we could be Jewish. So needless to say, about 5-10 years later is when my aunt has that foreign exchange student. She decided to research my family's genealogy, the tree, and where they come from in Guerrero, Mexico. And funny to find out, we had a priest buried in the cemetery there in the local town of Santo Tomas. And my mother's mom always said she was Spanish. She's from Spain. So once they did the research, they found out that my grandmother moved to the United States when she was about 6 years of age. Her mother brought her over here. And the family, when my uncle went to visit, they used to say that the family land was as far as the eye could see. You could turn around, and as far as your eye could see belonged to my mother's family in that town. And so we had a priest that was buried in one of the churches there, and then we found out later that my grandmother had it wrong. She used to say that her last name was Vencon de Ledesma of Ledesma, Spain. It turned out that her name was Ben Cohen, and they're from Ledesma, the Ledesma, Spain region near Madrid. So it turns out that we were actually of Jewish ancestry. So we were definitely found out that we were conversos. Because nobody for generations, I don't think we knew that we were actually of Jewish ancestry. So what was nice was when I heard the story and the research was done, I told my mother, you see, I was right. I saw that picture and I just knew. I said, just look at the eyes, look at the noses, and you can I just feel it. I sense that you're Jewish. And so it was really interesting in looking and learning with Mary when she's doing her research on the actual percentage. So if you see that you're 2% Jewish, or you actually, if you look at more the regions that your makeup in your DNA comes, it tells you that your probability is that much higher that you're maybe more. And unfortunately, we were not, I don't think we were crypto Jews, or if they were crypto Jews, that happened a long time ago, right? The ones that secretly practiced during the time of the Spanish Inquisition. And I'm sure that many of you will, if you do your research, like to use it.
An MA in History and her MFA in Creative Writing from Utah. She studied fine arts at Pasadena City College and the Art Center College of Design. Former editor of Border Sense, she was coordinator of the Congreso Editorial Mexicana Contemporánea and Revista de Lectura. That's pretty rough. For 12 years. That must be somewhat Aztec. She was a Smithsonian Fellow in the Latin Image Representation and Interpretation Institute. Her work, poetic, graphic, narrative, and editorial has been published in Peru, Spain, Argentina, Mexico, China, the Netherlands, and the United States. She received Voces al Sol Award from the Universidad Autónoma de Ciudad Juárez in 2015 for her work as a playwright. Dr. Chu's research focuses on racial relations, the Asian and African diasporas, and World War II. She is an associate professor of instruction at the Department of History and the African American Studies program. Her publications of Rooting Community, Japanese Mexicans, World War II in the U.S., Mexico borderlands. She was awarded an International Latino Book Award and the Southwest Book Award in 2017. Dr. Chu will receive a second doctoral degree in May 2023 in Social Cultural Foundations of Education by Utah. She is Associate Dean for the Graduate Studies at the College of Liberal Arts, University of Texas, El Paso. Doctor?
All right, so identidad, right? Identity. We are here to talk about identity. And I would like to start with the fact that a lot of the problems that we have now in terms of the Mexican identity, if it is a race, if it is an ethnicity, if it is only a nationality, what is Mexicanidad? And of course, we are gonna go beyond the revolutionary period, but after the Mexican Revolution, Jose Vasconcelos, who was from Oaxaca, where my mother is from, and actually is called the Black State because of the large presence of persons of African descent, he theorized that La Raza de Bronce was the perfect race, right? He believed in race, in the notion of race. And so he stated that because it was a mixture of all races, which we already said it's false because there are no races, right? But he stated that because Mexicans had genes from what he called the white people, right, or white social sectors, Asian, indigenous, and black, that we as Mexicans had all positive attributes from each particular group. And that's not possible, right? Because you have already said it. Who defines positive to begin with? What is positive? So he stated that the Mexican population was improving, and that by itself it was rejecting the social groups that were not desirable. And guess which groups were those? The bad ones. Were they white? No, right? In his hierarchy, white was at the top. And then Asian, but only one community, one Asian community, the Japanese community. So my ancestors, Chinese, Cantonese, were not desirable in this mixture. And then indigenous, and then at the bottom, persons of African descent. Right? So it was not actually a mixture, but it was a ranking. And so this notion of la raza cósmica is very much affecting the way Mexican persons identify themselves. They are very, very proud of being a mixture, but we tend to favor a nuestros abuelitos españoles. Right? Because there are privileges that come with that classification, with that identity. If we assert that our genes are white, European, then we acquire this social value. And that's why we also try to distance ourselves from other communities, from other roots, from the Asian, from the indigenous, and from the African roots of Mexico. There are many, many ways to express that anti-black attitude that has been denied. And until today, if you ask a person in Mexico, a Mexican racist, they would be offended by that. They would say, no, of course not, we are not. But we are. We are because we have been trained to value whiteness and despise any non-white community, but particularly African communities, right? So that's the concept of la raza cósmica, and only until very recently, negritude is a term that persons of African descent are using with pride, just as we are using also pocho, right? They have adopted it as a marker of pride, but it has taken centuries for them to get to this point in which they openly are recognizing that there is a history of which they must be proud. So if I have time, because I know I have too many topics and very little time, but these are some topics that I would like to cover. The notion that Africa starts in Spain. I would like to talk about the black conquistadors, also black enslaved persons, the Atlantic trade, representations through the casta paintings, how we buy whiteness in Mexico, right? I would like to talk about Florida and Louisiana as places that were occupied by the Spanish Empire, and through which persons of African descent became very, very important residents, and then the importance of blackness in legal frames in New Spain and then Mexico, the abolition of slavery in 1829, Texas and slavery, and some aspects of Black Mexico today. So, as I said before, there are several ways to determine Spain negritude, blackness, right? Spain, or the Iberian area in general, because it wasn't only Spain, but also Portugal, had for almost 800 years, almost 8 centuries, the presence of Africans as rulers, right? The Spanish culture is very much immersed in Africa. Granted, North Africa mainly, but the presence of Sub-Sahara Africa, it has also been felt in many, many, many ways. Nevertheless, the fact that it was ruled for almost 8 centuries created a different racial hierarchy for Spain and Portugal, different from Germany, different from England. Many Spaniards are of mixed descent, and so their standards to determine who was white had to be very different than the standards the British established in the United States. Because if they set them very high, they themselves were not going to fit in them, right? And that's why there is a system in Latin America to buy whiteness. Even today, there are some ways, and I will tell you the stories about my experience as a person who is non-white, right? But the thing is that when Spain invaded what is now Mexico and established a very strict racial system of control, people were classified. They were classified as españoles, right, and indios to begin with, La República de Españoles and La República de Indios, the Republic of Indian communities and the Republic of Spanish individuals. But then Europeans introduced, kidnapped, or bound persons in Africa who were trafficked and imported into the American continent. And so privileges were officially granted through certificates, quality, right? Quality. And of course, those who were of quality, of calidad, were white persons. But as I said, many Españoles were not completely white. And so, phenotypes did not correspond exactly to the certificate that they had. And if they were persons who had the means to appear as wealthy and had other attributes that were considered calidad, then they could practically buy their certificate, certificado de calidad. So New Spain was a very complex society in terms of racism. We can say now that in Mexico, if you have one drop of Spanish blood, you can claim being white, actually. While in the United States, if you had one drop of what they call black blood, you were deemed black, right? So there, in New Spain, colonial New Spain, and now in Mexico, you have that possibility. If you are not white, that can be overlooked. If you have money, and if you have cultural capital in general. When I go to the market in Mexico City, that's where I usually go to the market, right? And I walk in with my Western clothes, and particularly if there is a domestic employee with me in the market, I'm gonna be called. What? Have you been in Mexico City or any other market in Mexico? No? Okay, when you enter, the vendors are trying to attract you, right? To their merchandise. So if they see that you have money, they're gonna call you güerita. Güerita, güerita, venga güerita. Right? Am I güerita? No, I'm not. I'm only güerita because it looks like I have money. Right? Exactly. So that's a process that I started in the colonial era, where persons who were not absolutely white, even if their phenotype was Afro-Mexican, Afro-Indigenous, Afro-Mestizo, Asian, Indigenous, etc., they could buy a certificado de calidad. They could pass as white. And that goes until pretty recently. The last governor of California, Pio Pico Rivera, was black. But he became a powerful person because he was powerful. He had power, economic and political power. And so were other Afro-Mexicans, such as Vicente Guerrero, who was the second president of Mexico, was Afro-Hispano. And then Afro-Mexico because he actually was part of the war against Spain, and which successfully evicted Spanish persons from power. But our first president of African descent had that post at the beginning of the 19th century. right? And actually he worked very hard to abolish slavery, and that's why Mexico lost Texas. Because of the introduction of enslaved persons into Texas by white Americans from the United States who insisted in breaking the Mexican law by keeping persons enslaved, right? So a lot to discuss, and which starts in Spain. But as I said before, there are several ways through which persons of African origin arrived in what is now Mexico. One thing is clear, and from the very first moment of the conquest, the conquista, African persons were with Hernán Cortés. Men and women. And some of them were free. And some of them acquired their freedom later. Because another difference between racism in Mexico, or New Spain in this case, and the colonial world in what is now the United States, is that persons, African persons, and their descendants could acquire their freedom. There was that hope, that possibility, and that was very, very real. We mentioned the first militia, and that first militia in what is now the United States probably was a black militia in Louisiana or Florida, or what is now Texas or New Mexico. Because African men could join the militia and acquire ranks and honors. So that's a difference also that we should note. In that way, black Hispanos could be with the power that subjected and oppressed indigenous persons, right? In that campaign, and they received land and honors. But they could also be honored auxiliaries and still be able to buy their freedom and to have some type of comfortable life and position within the New Spain society. But then most persons of African descent were part of the more than 200,000 individuals who were kidnapped in Africa and introduced into Mexico. But those 200,000 persons are not all black Hispanos, because they had children, grandchildren, right? Descendants. So the black population became very, very, very large. At one point in the 17th century, there were 7 black persons per Spaniard. And if we imagine the impact of the Spanish conquista over the indigenous population, then we can assess the importance of persons of African descent who were introduced to perform the labor that indigenous populations could not perform because they were decimated. And so even those communities which right now we think as pure indigenous, perhaps have also African genes, because that was the only way in which they could reproduce. Well, actually not, and that's the other aspect that is part of the story, right? That Professor Aragonés mentioned, because there was also a mixture of other persons, in which is very much depicted here through the casta paintings. Are you familiar with the casta paintings? Right, yes, I can tell that you are. Well, these are not actual representations of families, okay? They are just imaginary representations that were meant to classify the residents, the persons who integrated the Spanish Empire in Las Americas, in the American continent, classifying them according to different labels, right? They imagine labels. And so these casta paintings had different numbers of classifications, but in reality, historians have gone through the historical records and found out that all the classifications that are labeled here, that are presented to, were presented to Spain mainly, they were actually painted for the consumption of residents of Spain, did not correspond actually with the use of the term. So a person would not say, I'm a coyote, right? Or I am a saltapatras. Perhaps one term that was very, very used was mulatto, right? Mulatto was actually used, but some other terms in the church records state the origin of the person, not he is black or he is pardo or he, no. This person is from the Congo, right, or from other Angola, etc., etc. So these classifications are not real, not only in the way they were represented, but classifications were not exactly used, at least not in everyday life. Nevertheless, they tell us that the mixing of persons was very different to that in the United States. That was at least sanctioned, right? It was approved. I can say that until certain limits. Only until certain limits these were approved. Because the fact is, do we have minors here? Can we cover his? Okay. The fact is that sexual violence took place. And that some of these idyllic, some of them are idyllic, some of them are not, but some of these relationships were very violent. And that's a reality that we tend to forget when we examine the occupation of Europeans, of the Americas, right? Another aspect is that usually it was racialized women who married below their status, their status. So, for example, a person who is labeled here as parda married a black man, not a Spanish or a Criollo. And that's in the records. There is demographic data about or that reflect the condition of women in the colonial world, right? There was no such a thing as free social mobility. There were various factors.
He's a professor at the University of Texas, El Paso. Aragones offers courses in Chicano studies, cultural diversity, and Latina presence in the U.S. He has done a book review on reading, writing, and revolution, Escuelitas and the Emergence of a Mexican-American Identity in Texas, by Phyllis M. Barragan Poets, Journal of Latinos in Education 2021. Aragones has had various presentations at UTEP, some of them being the U.S.-Mexico border in Ciudad Juarez of El Paso 2023, El Paso Juarez Borderlands 2023, and Border Culture, Politics, and Economics 2023. Mr. Aragones, you have the floor, sir.
Because this conversation has to be had within the context of U.S. history, but it also has to be held in part within context of Mexican history. Because Mexican-American history is Mexican-American is a very fluid term. And so Mexican-American occupies multiple spaces at one time. Or I'm sorry, it's multiple things occupying one space at one time. And so the other question I ask, and this is what happens when you're the only liberal arts person among scientists, and you ask them, so can one thing be more than one thing at the same time? And then one friend says, well, actually, Einstein said that a particle could be, and after that I don't know what he said. All I heard was, yes, Einstein, that's all I need for validation. And I think about Mexican Americans, it's the same thing, right? 4th of July, we have carne asada and hot dogs. Oh, you tell where I'm at right now? So this is how I think about Mexican American. So jumping to the historical context, and this is where we'll go to more into the labels and this idea of Chicano. Mexican American, we see it used a lot after the U.S.-Mexico War. What's really interesting is that Mexican nationals who were living in the U.S. after the war pretty much said, okay, I guess we're American and Mexican. But the idea of Mexican American was largely used to differentiate what you are and what you are not. And so the communities took it upon themselves and said, well, this is how they keep referring to us, so now we're going to put our flavor into it. We're going to give this thing shape to how we see it. So the way we use Mexican American now is not how it was intended before. Right? And that's a really interesting thing. And why does that matter? Why do I bring it up? What's really interesting is that if we listen to a lot of the conversations with curriculum and children and what's being taught, what I am talking about right now, when my brother in the back said, well, it's about labels and these things, I heard, I think one of mis hermanas said, Chicano, Chicana. These are terms that are very part and parcel of trying to understand what Mexican American means, but then you have areas, and this is not my opinion, this is a matter of historical record, you have states that will not allow children to have these conversations with their teachers. Now I understand there's certain things that we can't talk about that have to be age appropriate. I'm not disregarding that at all. However, to have a child understand this is who I am, where I come from, is a very powerful thing. Because in the things that I've read and in my experience, which my experience is just one person, is insignificant in a larger scale, but for me it's everything. We're taught you live in the United States, you're an American. I was born in Juarez, raised in Chicago. And I was in our house was a Mexican household. You walk in and there's a picture of Jesus right there. La Virgencita is in another room, and you have all these things. And then when you go outside, en la casa se habla así. As soon as you step in the backyard and you see your friend, hey, what's going on, Jimmy? What's going on? Hey, I'll be right back. Mamá, ¿puedo salir? Okay, sí, regreso a las 6. And then there you go. That's how it was. It wasn't of this or that. And it almost seems to me as an educator and as a father that there's this belief that in my household I'm teaching my children, you must be American. America is evil. On the contrary, in our house we have an image of my grandfather, World War II veteran. Con su permiso, todo chingón. Boom, right there. Individual, like that's how we remember him. And we remember my mother-in-law, she was a farm worker. An amazing woman in so many ways. Right? And I know that I'm awesome in my cooking because my mother-in-law said one time, Adrian, this is really good, you should open up a restaurant. I was done. Like, I was done. All those cooking shows, I know I would. Because if my sweater is telling me that I can cook, I'm done. Like, but it's this thing of, sorry, I actually do this in my class, and I think people sign up for my class just to see what I'm going to say next, not necessarily the material. It's this thing of thinking about what Mexican American means. And I'll give you another example where, and I'm going to talk about the reality of how it's taught, not through rose-colored glasses. Then I'm going to give you a response to rose-colored glasses perspective. Because it can't, in my opinion, I always say in class, if we talk about something, we're going to talk about the bad, and we're going to talk about the good, because there has to be a balance. And let the individuals make up their mind which way it goes. My job is not to sway you either way. So, one of the things that, in terms of history, we have, in fact, you know what, excuse me, I'm going to show you, I got something here. Marisol said, don't go by the window out there, it's not good for the camera. I'm sorry, Marisol. So here's a book that I use to teach U.S. history. It's called Give Me Liberty by Eric Foner. Eric Foner, very nice man, met him once upon a time, long time ago. Very nice. So when you take U.S. history in the United States, it's required. In college, you have to take a basic history course for your degree plan. Now, when you take, now our students have the option to do dual credit, early college courses, things of the nature, probably the book they're going to use. So there's two. There's volume 1 that talks about from the earliest native peoples up to including the Civil War Reconstruction. Then this one, volume 2, teaches from after the Civil War to the present. Okay. Like I said, nice guy, but that has nothing to do with the book. This is the book where people learn about our history in the United States, which is an amazing history. Not contesting that. The problem is, who are the key players? Who did the influences? Not one reference in the second one that talks from the after the Civil War to the present. The greatest generation of Great Depression, World War II, I think we can agree that those were amazing people. Not one reference to the almost 250,000 Mexican American men that went to war. Not one reference. What's that? Well, it's simple. Each book has 16 chapters, 74 subchapters, and roughly 100 and some odd subsections. If you are learning history, let's say you're away from the border, and you're going to learn about Mexican Americans, you're going to learn about U.S. history, the only connection you find to Mexican Americans and their ancestors is the following. In the first book, like I said, there's 16 chapters, 74 subchapters, and X amount of sections. In there, you read about the Spanish Conquista, which where they use genocide to establish themselves. And that's a conversation that's there. The second one is they reference Mexicans as the bad guys in the Texas Revolution. The third one is Mexicans as the bad guys in the U.S.-Mexico War. That's it. That's it. That's all we have. So if you have people go to school that, for example, communities that are away from the border, that don't really know Mexican or Mexican American culture, that's what they'll learn, that in American history, my ancestors, that's all they did. And then if you look at the second half of history in the second book, same amount of chapters, whatever, the only reference to my ancestors are refugees fleeing the Mexican Revolution, anything to do with illegal immigration, and then there's a little blurb about the Zoot Suit riots. And there you go.
Don't forget that the Mexicans were the bad guys in the Alamo.
Yeah, with the revolution. Yeah, absolutely. And so it's like what happened. And so then you have, thank you for that. In the Texas Revolution against War, you have individuals that were of Latino descent, to keep it general. They were either Latino, depending on who's writing about them, Tejanos, Mexican Americans, or Americans of Mexican descent. And does anybody know one of the, how can I say it? One of the key individuals in the Texas Revolution, U.S.-Mexican War, he was Tejano. Anybody know? extra credit. You guys heard of Seghs, Texas? Juan Seghs. Juan Seghs was the man. Now I say it that way, and not, again, just from a perspective that, wow, this guy did some really amazing things. He had contemporaries that did some amazing things. And the only thing we know about Juan Seghs, Juan Seghs was instrumental in winning in those two conflicts. And what happens to Juan Seghs? They approach him, and I think in many ways this is they were foreshadowing what was going to happen. Juan Seghs was approached by his brother in arms, and they said, "You got to go." What do you mean I got to go? We're taking your political capital, your financial capital, the lands, everything. Why? Because you're Mexican. I fought for the Americans because I believe in what they're doing. And you know what the response was to them? Or their response to him was, at the end of the day, you're still Mexican. And he went into obscurity until they brought him back out, right? Now, am I saying that, and when I talk about these types of things in this way, I get feedback where they say, well, you know, you're really disparaging American history. No, we're not. No, we're not. I tell them, you know that the American Revolution, we know about the patriots that were the Marquis de Lafayette, France, von Steuben from Prussia, Germany. These were significant individuals that without their help, the U.S. does not have them. But do you know about Bernardo de Galvez?
Of course.
Not everybody does. Here we do, but a lot of extra credit right here. Extra credit. Bernardo de Galvez, if you're not familiar, was a Spaniard who was governor of what we now call Louisiana, and he was funneling money, ammunitions, and guns under the table to the Patriots. Because the Americans, and the Americans had no standing army to speak of, they were long defiance and such and such. And it's a great story. People talk about the American Revolution. Okay, great. So where's the chapter, what part of the chapter where we can say that all these different people contributed? You put them, you put them, you put them. God, this is nowhere in there. And yet he was a key player. These are part and parcel of the problem, and I'm using that word specifically, problem, as to why students themselves are second guessing, how do you identify? Who are you? Right? Because even if you think about the name in and of itself, if you wrote Mexican American down, I want you to look at it. So now I'm going to take the role of psychiatrist. Look at it. If we are all Americans, because that's what we're told and that's what we're taught. And, okay, that's fine. Then why is that need hyphenated? Why do you need Mexican and why do you need American? And if you look at the longer list, only certain names are hyphenated and others aren't. And people say, well, everybody's been hyphenated. You have the Irish Americans, the German Americans. Absolutely. But the next time you fill out the census, look at the census and see where the hyphenations are. Why is that? Why is that there? And it's amazing that through all this, as one person told me, all this negativity, the community is resilient. It's amazing it's a contribution. During the Great Depression, they said, well, you know, one of the reasons why this Great Depression happened is because we have so many illegals here. So they did an inquiry and they found out that yes, there was an impact because of undocumented people. But what was the impact that they had? They had that they were, we know the story, they do the jobs that nobody else wants to do at a rate that nobody else will accept. If it wasn't for them, the theory was that the economy could have actually gone even worse than what it was. How does this connect to Mexican Americans? Well, going into the Depression, before the World War breaks out, World War II, you have mass deportations happening across the country. I think it's estimated somewhere within 2 million people were deported. Many of those Americans of Mexican descent. How does that happen? Because there is a disconnect between understanding that what Mexican American really means. And I'll use another example more to the point. When I give presentations and talks and conversations, it'll come up more often than not, and I'll say, well, you know, I was born in Juarez, raised in Chicago, came to El Paso, I was supposed to leave, but I met a girl, and that was it, right? In a great way. My daughter said, well, tell Mom I said it in a great way. Back me up on that. And so, what happens is I'll say, well, I'm Mexican, Mexican American, and Chicano in that order. And why is that? Well, I was born in Mexico. That's where my history comes from. I was raised in Chicago. Everybody's familiar with the South Side by Midway Airport. I have a little Midwestern accent flare up every now and then. And I'm Chicano because I know what my history is based on what my family has told me, based on what my school has told me, and I've come to a happy medium looking and reading and continuing this learning process. That's how I identify it. And so the response is, but you live in the United States, you're raising your kids here. Why don't you say American? But I did. I said it twice. Mexican, Mexican American, Chicano, no, I didn't hear. Mexican American, American of Mexican descent. But the writing of the word throws it off. Mexican American, Mexican is what they see first. And Chicano has largely been treated as something separate, something apart. But Chicano is an American phenomenon. It is what happened here. It's not in Mexico, it's not in any other border going south. It's here. And it's a way to push back. Not to say that I'm not American, but rather, in many cases, depending on who you ask, I'm more American than anybody, except than the Navy. Don't want to get into that argument. And so it's an ongoing process in terms of how people are negotiating, how they're thinking about their identities. I'm of the opinion that at home we get what I would consider, in terms of the classroom, some of the best education about who we are and where we come from. People, when my brother, he raises his kids, we're Americans, and we come from Mexico, and we're Americans of Mexican descent. And I'm right across from him at the table in my mom's backyard going, oh, sí, está bien, it's okay. And for me, it's the other way around. I think that everybody should go any way they feel comfortable. The only issue, if I can say that, is having the information available. The way that I just talked about the Texas Revolution in referencing to what was happening, or saying that Mexican Americans never didn't identify themselves as such at the beginning, actually comes into conflict with teaching standards in some of the states in the United States. It's gotten to the point where I think right now, and I could be off on my records or in my information, but I know that up until a few years ago, 9 states had to pass laws to say it's okay to talk about your ethnicity. It's okay to talk about African American studies, Mexican American, or whatever the case may be. The fact that people say, well, that's great. I'm like, no, the fact that we have to use a law to protect that, it should be a given. It should be a given. It takes time and effort. All you need to do to fix it is put a couple of paragraphs in a chapter. That's all you need. Because the myth is also that Mexican Americans are trying to replace this. No. History exists and it's right there. All we're doing is looking for a few maybe a chapter would be great, but let's go from paragraphs, right? Let's put let's put one thing in more detail. Let's talk about the amazing people who made changes when it comes to the labor force. I'm going to volunteer my daughter to do it. So I'm going to throw up some images just to give you an idea. This was kind of cool. These are just some images of people in conversations that come up about being Mexican American or what it means. And while I put my daughter in an uncomfortable position there, notice that I haven't said that Mexican American is this, Mexican American is that. I think it depends on the individual. Okay, so click on, here we go. Emma de Nayuca. She was a labor organizer, Mexican American. She's one of many reasons why the labor dynamic changed for Mexican American workers and other workers in the blue collar outfit. The state of Texas says, well, I don't know, we really want to talk about her because she's in labor movement that seems a little bit to the left, a communist. Trying to make a change. How is that any different? Can you put Jovita? Yeah. Earlier, the person who introduced me was gracious enough to reference a book review that I did. Jovita Hidalgo, she was in South Texas, and she had this, basically to put it simple, you have school, the diminutive little school, or escuelita. There were little escuelitas that were created because children that were viewed as Mexican were not allowed to go to school. You know the stories of segregation. And that is part of our collective history. So how about we say, well, what did that do? Jovita Hidalgo said, you know what, okay, if that's what you're going to do, then let me figure out a solution to that problem. And she created these schools. One of my favorite stories in the book by Phyllis Barragan. She writes how Jovita was starting up these escuelitas, and then there was one teacher, I just can't help but smile because she was a teacher who was Mexican. She was Mexican, fighting the Mexican Revolution. She basically said, hey, I need you to come and teach this class. The kids love you, do a great job. And she basically said, I got a mission to run, but once I'm done with the mission in the war, I'll come back and I'll teach. She left, went to fight, came back, okay, I'm ready, and she started to teach. That is a cool story. Why isn't it referenced? And this may be a little bit out of what purview of what I'm talking about, but how is talking about Jovita Hidalgo un-American? That's his apple pie. They would think if she, instead of saying apple pie, she'd probably just say manzana, but we're good. It's still the same difference. What else do I have? Let's put Monroe. Here's another Mexican-American woman that really changed. It was a game changer.
Her mother.
From her mom's side, yeah. Marilyn Monroe. And then the next one, this was, I'll admit, this was my my crush when I was a kid. With Miss Carter.
Oh, yeah.
Right? It's really cool stuff. Hey, give me a applause. Well, if you remember, if you know, she had a TV series. But one time that my mom could get me to come in from outside before the lights went on, right? Because I think that was the time. What do you gotta get home before the lights go on? Linda Carter, it's amazing. And then you have Joan Baez, can you type in that little truck? Astronaut. It's pretty cool. These little tidbits, these little snippets make a world of difference if we put them in the history books. My opinion, just my opinion. And I think that the reason I started off earlier by saying how there's this little hesitation, because we don't see these in the history books. We're not really allowed to talk about them. Dolores Huerta, Cesar Chavez, they're taken out of the history books because they're too far to the left. They were doing good things for people across the board. Right? And not to say that they were perfect. We have sinners and saints in one and the same individual, but at least have the information available so people can make a choice, make a conversation, and go forward. Right? These are the kind of things. But as I'm yammering on, I started off by including you, so I want to continue that. Any questions pop up or something comes to mind? I actually feel that I did something right because you look engaged or you're bored. Yes, sir.
Nowadays.
Go.
I have a quote about the hyphen. It's like when you die, you have a year you were born and the year you died, right? It's hyphenated. So when we say Mexican American, the hyphen stands for something that happened in between when we were Mexican and when we became American. And to me, it doesn't matter because we are born and raised in the Americas. So we are genuinely Americans.
Well, I agree with you.
That's America.
The pushback you get, though, is that people are not familiar that outside of the United States, in Las Americas. But in here, it's different. So again, it can get confusing depending on what the conversation is, who's leading the conversation, what's the end game of the conversation, all the other things. But yeah, I agree with what you're saying.
And then when you have this heroes like Huerta, other people that have changed the perception of Americans and Mexicans, they get labeled as communists.
Yes.
So it's all about labels.
Yes, go back to that, absolutely. I think I'm gonna, I'm sorry?
Who is doing the labeling is the problem.
Well, the answer to that question is why this is not taught in classes. Right? So when I teach my classes, I start off by saying, we're going to talk about whiteness. Well, talking about whiteness is not talking about white people. That's different, the way I teach it. It's looking at a society that is looking at society through structures that are influenced by race. And the reality is that's how it plays out. Earlier I mentioned Mexican American. Is it a race? Is it an ethnicity? Or is it an identity? Technically it should be an ethnicity because it's how people connect via language, music, cultural aspects. However, in the United States, it's largely used indirectly as a reference to race. When you hear about what's happening on the border and migrants in Mexico, the term Mexican pops up. People look at Segundo Barrio, South El Paso. Well, a lot of Mexicans live there. That's one of the, with respect to areas like Sanelli, Socorro, and such. These are some of the oldest communities in the United States, and people have been there, and their roots can go all the way back. But they're treated as our colleague said, well, they're really from over there. No, they've been here. But again, it's this inability to make a connect. And where I look and say, here's the issue, is because of what we talk about in the classrooms. And again, there's other factors. I'm not saying there's not, I'm not saying it's any one thing. And our teachers do amazing jobs. It's something that's larger than that. And we can't have these, look what's happening in Florida. In Florida, they can't teach certain classes because they feel that certain kids are going to feel bad about themselves. And I get that, and that should be nobody's priority, not even be on the list of to do. But the reality is that history is very ugly sometimes, and we have to acknowledge it. And I do believe, and it sounds a little over the top, but I do believe that in order to appreciate beauty, you have to understand what's not. And vice versa, it's a symbiotic relationship. It connects. And just because, for example, I tell my students, when we talk about the Holocaust, try to understand what the Nazis were thinking, it doesn't mean that we support what they did. We're just simply trying to understand so that, as they say, we don't do that again, or we can identify it and that. But we have to be able to engage it in these scenarios. But it seems that there's an individual named David Stannard. He wrote this article called Genocide in America, and he refers to this thing as worthy victims. He says that in American history, we acknowledge the atrocities done by one group over another around the world. But when it comes to the United States, we only talk about our heroes, and the only victims we talk about are the victims that are at the bad end of something that's coming, of something foreign. So for example, we will talk readily about the folks that died in 9/11, rightfully so we should. But why don't we talk about the brothers and sisters in the indigenous communities in the United States? We don't talk about it. Next week, I start a conversation on the Carlisle Indian schools that we have here in the United States. And I had once, it never fails, in the last, I've only come to the topic a few times, maybe, again, off the top of my head, maybe in the last 5 years, 3 times. And I've had students that got upset at that, said, no. It happened. It happened. And you have this. And this is a product of the work. So really quickly as I wind down, I didn't get to it I wanted to. You might still invite me again, maybe not. That's okay, I understand. Because I actually make me do work. But Chicano is an extension, in my opinion, of Mexican American. And it is an identity that somebody has based on this idea of self-determination as it applies to that person. If you don't identify as Chicano, it doesn't make you more or less of anything. It could be as simple as, I'm wearing a green shirt, you're wearing a blue shirt. It's by our preference. For me, if you ask me why do I identify as Chicano, like I said earlier, I do that because going through the school system, I realized there's a lot of my history that was left out. And so now I'm very well aware of it. And I know a lot of my history, not because of the education system, but in spite of it. And I know that sounds very aggressive, but I don't mean that in a bad way. I always, and this is where I'll close, I always remember when my grandfather said, rest his soul. He was here in El Paso, I was growing up in Chicago, and then he'd always say to me, Mijo, how are you? I'm like, okay, well, how are you doing? And I love it because we did the whole Spanglish thing, and he taught me Calo. If you know Calo, you know, we're talking about old school. The language of the Zoot Suiters. My grandfather said, Mijo, that's why I went to war as an American, so you can do whatever you want. Just be nice to people. You don't want to see your grandpa mad. That's what he said. He said, do whatever you want, just be nice to people. And I remember that, and it's what I do in terms of these conversations. But did I see a hand back there?
Yeah, I wanted to hear it.
Oh, that's fair. Did you? Yes?
Oh, well, finish that, but I have a question.
No, I'm good. Go for it, please.
Okay, I have a question. How do you define the term Latin X now? The new one now.
Yeah, okay, so I was wondering if that was going to come up. So here we go. And I'll give you a concrete example. So many years ago, I was very blessed to be where I went to undergrad school, and we did a banquet. So it was a predominantly white school, great experience, you know, no problem. But there was a lot of first-generation college students there. So one student, I'll never forget, she said, and we're still friends to this day, she said, you know, it's great that my parents are going to be at my graduation ceremony, but they're not going to understand what's being said. And that's part of the experience. So we said, well, what if we have a graduation banquet, we'll raise the money, we'll get, you know, whatever, and we'll just go through where you come up and get a certificate, and the person giving you the certificate would say what they would normally say at the commencement. School was supportive, it was a beautiful thing. So we called it the Latino graduation banquet because we had students that were Cuban, Guatemalan, the whole 9 yards. Fast forward, and now I revisited, I was there actually a couple weeks ago in Chicago, and now it's called the Latinx graduation banquet. So, well, what are your thoughts on that? This was my immediate response. I think it was almost knee-jerk. I said, you call yourself whatever you like, that's fine. Right? But here's the issue. Latinx, as a term, there's a lot of where it comes from. Right? Because the idea is that Latinx, like the variable in algebra, you could identify as Latino, Latina, it's up to the individual, which I'm all about that. But I think that if looking at it from the lens of my community has been labeled over and over and over again, and nobody ever asked us, who are you? What would you like to be called? So with Latinx, there's still some, what does it mean? So for me, I don't use it. If somebody says, if La Hermana says, well, I'm Latinx, I'll acknowledge as such. I have no problem with it. I think it just depends on the individual, but in terms of how it fits in academia, we should interrogate to see where it comes from. What is interrogating, not in a bad way, just to understand where it goes. Because if we have long-standing terms like Latino, Hispanic, Chicano, Mexican-American, and people are still kind of like this, you're just adding more, and then it's going to be more like this. I know it's not a specific answer to your question, but I'm still kind of, thinking about it and see where it fits, but live and let live.
Well, we've had so many, from Mexican-American, Latino, Hispanic, Chicano, now Latinx.
Yeah.
If I don't count up the choice forms, I don't see any of that. I only see Hispanic when you go fill out the insurance form.
Yes.
Or to the doctor.
Yeah.
And it says Hispanic.
Yeah, on that term, I would put money, so I know she's sorry.
So shall we call ourselves Hispanics?
Well, that one I have more of a specific answer. With Hispanic.
Well, there's no other option.
Well, actually, with Hispanic, the way that came about was really to lump everybody into one category to make it easy to identify. Exactly. And so Hispanic doesn't take into account, at least the way I agree, it's not my original thought. It doesn't take into account brothers and sisters, Afro-Latinos, and brothers and sisters in Brazil, Portuguese, because there's more of that connect to the European aspect. Given the choice, I choose Latino because it does incorporate brothers and sisters from a wider spectrum. But if in those conversations I say I would be more critical of the term Hispanic than I would Latinx, because Latinx is very new, we don't know where it's going and all that stuff. But Hispanic is really a term that I think is a misnomer in many ways. But again, live and let live, and maybe one day when I get all the power, then I'll change it, but until then, or a winning lottery ticket.
What, am I gonna change it to?
What's that?
How would you change it to? Latino?
In a broader spectrum, in a broader spectrum.
Norteño or sureño?
What's that?
I know.
What was that?
North or south?
Norteño or sureño?
That's a whole other conversation. Well, folks, thank you so much for the time. I think I went over